το μεταπτυχιακό του Πανεπιστημίου για την τιμή που μας κάνατε να συνδιοργανώσουμε το συνέδριο αυτό. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τους ομιλητές αυτού του συνεδρίου, τον κύριο Νίκο Αναστασιάδη, τον κύριο Γιαννόπουλο Βασίλη, τον κύριο Βαστάβο Θοδόρο, τον κύριο Chris Barrett και τον κύριο Ζους Λούμανς. Mr. Lumans, Mr. Barrett, welcome to Greece and thank you for your presence to the seminar, to the conference. Your presence here is it's an honor for all of us. We believe that in the future we will do more conference, better quality, and you will be able and responsible to give us all the evolution about diving. Thank you. Επίσης, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω για την παρουσία τους τους καθηγητές του Πανεπιστημίου. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την παρουσία σας. Και τέλος, να ευχαριστώ όλους εσάς που είστε εδώ πέρα, οι οποίοι πιο πολύ με γνωρίζετε και προσωπικά και γνωρίζετε τον αγώνα που κάνω, να αναβαθμίσουμε την κατάδυση, να τη φτάσουμε σε επίπεδα που τους αξίζει στην Ελλάδα, και μου έχει ανατεθεί ο ρόλος πάνω στην τεχνική κατάδυση. Το σύνθημα προσωπικά είναι μεγαλύτερη απόλαυση με μεγαλύτερη ασφάλεια. Και όλα αυτά περνάνε πολλές φορές από κάποιες πιο εξειδικευμένες διαδικασίες, και η εκπαίδευση που κάνουμε ονομάζεται τεχνική κατάδυση. Αυτό το συνέδριο θα πετύχει, έχει ήδη πετύχει με την παρουσία τη δικιά σας. Και αυτό είναι το σημαντικότερο κομμάτι. Άρα λοιπόν πρέπει να ξέρετε ότι με την παρουσία συμβάλλετε στην εξέλιξη της κατάδυσης στην Ελλάδα. Να είστε σίγουροι και σίγουρες ότι αυτή η δικιά σας συμμετοχή θα ενεργοποιήσει μία σειρά εξελίξεων που σας πρόσχομαι πολύ σύντομα να τις δείτε. Το συνέδριο αυτό, όταν το ξεκίνησα σαν ιδέα, έγινε αφορμή δύο βασικών λόγων. Πρώτον, διότι η εταιρεία μου, οι Underwater Explorers, συμπλήρωσαν 6 χρόνια παρουσίας στον χώρο της κατάδυσης, με πολλά μικρά και δειλά βηματάκια στην αρχή, και νομίζω ότι τώρα έχουμε σταθεροποιηθεί στον χώρο της κατάδυσης και μπορούμε να συνεχίσουμε ακόμα πιο οικοδομητικά. Επίσης, επίσημα μπορώ να σας πω ότι έχουμε αναλάβει την εκπροσώπευση ενός από τους μεγαλύτερους οργανισμούς τεχνικής κατάδυσης στην Ελλάδα, της TDI, Technical Diving International. Μας τιμά η επιλογή τους και σίγουρα θα την τιμήσουμε. Σε γενικές γραμμές, το πρόγραμμα του συνεδρίου το γνωρίζετε όλοι. Θα ήθελα να το επαναλάβω. Θα ξεκινήσει ο κύριος Δ. Νίκος Αναστασιάδης, δάσκαλός μου, τον οποίο τον ευχαριστώ γιατί μου έχει προσφέρει μέχρι σήμερα, ο οποίος είναι βιολόγος, ειδικευμένος στην καταδική φυσιολογία. Το θέμα θα είναι η φυσιολογία των μεικτών αδρανών αερίων. Στη συνεχεία θα μιλήσει ο κύριος Chris Barrett, ο οποίος είναι ο σχεδιαστής του Abyss Software και του computer του Abyss Explorer. Θα μιλήσει κυρίως για το θέμα της αποσυμπίεσης, τη νέα θεωρία αποσυμπίεσης, τους αλγόριθμους RGBM, θα μιλήσει και για deep stops. Αυτές τις μέρες μεταφράζαμε κάποια από τα κείμενά του και μπορώ να σας πω ότι αυτά θα ακούσετε αποτελούν επανάσταση στον χώρο της κατάδυσης. Συνεχεία θα κάνουμε ένα διάλειμμα και θα ξαναβρεθούμε όπου θα προβάλλουμε slides από την τελευταία εξερευνητική μας αποστολή στον Άγιο Νικόλαο της Κρήτης και θα απονείμουμε πιστοποιητικά συμμετοχή στους συμμετέχοντες. Στη συνεχεία θα έχετε την ευκαιρία να δείτε πρώτοι slides από το σπήλαιο Μελισσάνη στην Κεφαλονιά, το οποίο θα είναι ο επόμενος στόχος μας της εξερευνητικής μας ομάδας. Εδώ θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω ιδιαίτερα τον κύριο Γιαννόπουλο Βασίλη, ο οποίος είναι ο έφορος σπηλαιολογίας, ο οποίος μας δίνει αμέριστη συμπαράσταση, και χάρη τη δικιά του συμπαράσταση και της άδειάς του μπορούμε να κάνουμε αυτές τις εκδηλώσεις. Εμείς από την πλευρά μας, κύριε Γιαννόπουλε, το γνωρίζετε και σας ευχαριστούμε, θα προσέχουμε πάρα πολύ και θα είμαστε πολύ προσεκτικοί στην δραστηριότητά μας. Σας ευχαριστούμε και ιδιαίτερα. Στη συνεχεία θα μιλήσει ο κύριος Θόδωρος Παπασταύρου, γιατρός ορειλά, τον γνωρίζετε όλοι, στον χώρο της κατάδυσης έχει προσφέρει πάρα πολλά, ο οποίος είναι ειδικευμένος στην καταδική ιατρική. Το Το θέμα του θα είναι οι ειδικές ιατρικές όψεις της τεχνικής κατάδυσης και πιστέψτε ότι θα ακούσετε πολλά πράγματα καινούργια. Στο πρόγραμμα είναι ο κύριος Παναγιώτης Κωτηλέας, ο οποίος για κάποιο λόγο μάλλον θα αργήσει, θα έρθει κάποια στιγμή, ο οποίος είναι καρδιολόγος, εκπαιδευμένος στην υπερβαρική ιατρική. Θέμα του η πρόληψη του καταδικού ατυχήματος και της νόσης των δυτών. Στη συνεχεία θα μας μιλήσει ο κύριος Ζουστ Λούμανς με εταιρεία Drager, μια πολύ γνωστή και σημαντική εταιρεία στον χώρο της κατάδυσης. Θέμα του θα είναι φυσικά τα rebreather και η εξελίξη αυτών. Τέλος, ένα από τα πιο θεαματικά κομμάτια του συνεδρίου θα είναι αυτό του κ. Γιαννόπουλου, ο οποίος είναι σπηλαιοδίδης διδάκτου γεωλογίας και υπεύθυνος φορείας παλαιανθρωπολογίας και σπηλαιολογίας, και θα μας προβάλλει slides και βίντεο τα σπήλαια Γουλιαγμένης, Δουρού και το σπήλαιο του Ελεφάντων. Επίσης θα μας μιλήσει για τους κινδύνους στην σπηλαιοκατάδυση. Στη συνεχεία θα κάνουμε ένα διάλειμμα και στη συνεχεία θα γίνει μια στρογγυλή τράπεζα που θα μπορούσαμε όλοι να συζητήσουμε, να έχουμε σημειώσεις στα βλογάρια που ήδη έχετε όλοι σας μπροστά σας, ερωτήσεις που θα απευθύνονται στους ομιλητές και θα μπορούν να σας απαντήσουν. Είμαι σίγουρος ότι το συνέδριο θα είναι απόλυτα πετυχημένο. Και επαναλαμβάνω, αυτό θα συμβεί διότι εσείς, κύριοι, είστε εδώ που είστε και μας δίνετε με την παρουσία σας, μας τιμάτε.
Rewinding a videotape. We're going to try something new here, at least new for me. I travel around the world doing presentations on decompression theory. I have a very nice technical presentation on a slideshow, but it's in English. For the last 3 days, we've been translating it into Greek. Now, I don't speak or read a word of Greek, so I'm going to be looking at my slide, looking for cues, and I won't see what I need, but I've written it all down. So we're going to see if this works. My name's Chris Barrett. I'm the founder of Abysmal Diving in Boulder, Colorado. For the last 8 years, I've made my living doing decompression theory, looking at the numbers, looking at algorithms, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And the presentation that I'm going to show you today is a slideshow that I've been using for the last couple of years as I travel around the world doing conferences just like this. The goal of the presentation is to ask 4 questions. First, the assumption I'm going to have is that all of you are divers, and what we want to do is to go deep. The second thing we want to do is to stay as long as whatever the dive requires, whether on a cave exploration or a wreck dive or any activity. You want the depth and you want the time that you desire. The third is that we want the shortest possible decompression. I want to go down, I want to make my dive, and I want to come back up as quickly as possible. The fourth is that we don't want to get bent. It's very easy to go deep, to stay long, and come up immediately, and go right to the chamber. I'm assuming none of you want to go to the chamber. So these are our goals: time, depth, minimum decompression, and not to get bent on the way up. The assumption that I'm making modeling is that phase separation, or the creation of bubbles within your body, is what causes decompression sickness. That is an assumption. It's not an absolutely proven fact. In all likelihood, that's what's happening. My solution for DCS prevention is to stop bubbles. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at tissue saturation, which is the common model that we've been using for the last 30 or 40 years. The new model in the last 5 years is starting to suggest that we can start to forget about saturation and begin to look at the physical bubbles. If we can stop the bubble, then I believe we can stop all of the trouble. There won't be any DCS if there aren't any bubbles. Gradual pressure reduction, in other words, as we bring the diver back up from the dive, slow ascents or gradual reductions minimizes the opportunity for the bubble to form. The question is now, how do we do it? Computational algorithms are complex ideas. The only way to calculate decompression with bubble models is through large, very complex algorithms. The establishment and evolution of gas phases and possible bubble trouble involves a number of distinct and yet overlapping steps. The 4 steps are nucleation and stabilization. Now, nucleation is probably a brand new word to almost every diver in here. Our theory says that your body, as you're sitting here right now, has thousands and thousands of little micronuclei. They're not bubbles. They're the beginning of a bubble. They're the seed. It's the point where a bubble begins to form. Your body's full of these. And these eventually begin to grow and create bubbles. Supersaturation is where the gas that you breathe goes into your body. It's in solution, and that is what attaches to these micronuclei. As many of these micronuclei come together, they coalesce. That is the point where a bubble begins, and that's what we're trying to stop. We don't want to see this aggregation or this coalescence. Once this happens, the 4th point, in this case, excuse me, the 5th point, is deformation or occlusion. That's the moment that you get bent. That's where the damage has occurred to your body. That's what we're trying to stop. All right. Here's the hardest thing we had to translate. The person that I work with is Dr. Wanke. Dr. Wanke works at the Los Alamos National Laboratories in the United States. He is a true nuclear scientist. He works on atomic bombs, and he has access to some really powerful computers. What he said is that it is possible to have a grand theory. What this explains is how complex a grand theory of decompression would be. It is a very, very complicated algorithm. Our PCs, the desktop computers we have, would be utterly incapable of calculating one dive. On his craves, the fastest computers in the world, these calculations take 24 hours. They're astoundingly complex to create one single profile. But the result of this is a very, very good profile that takes into account a lot of information. He told me that costs such a significant amount of money that it's just not available for diving research. There's no university, there's no organization that's going to give up these computers for months and months of computing time to run these simulations. The reason I show you this is so that you'll know that's what we want. That is our goal. That's the golden fleece, as it were, of diving theory. If we can get to this type of an algorithm at some point, we can probably get darn near close to perfect decompression. There's 2 types of bubble theory that are currently competing. One that's called VPM and one that's called RGBM. The VPM was the first bubble model that really gained any significant acceptance in the scientific community. The RGBM is the second level, or the evolution, of the VPM. My specialty is in the RGBM, but I'm going to give you a lot of history on the VPM today so that you'll have some background and understand some of the theory of what we do. VPM stands for Variable Permeability Model. It's a bubble that changes its ability for the gas to move in and out under different pressures and under different tensions. Therefore, the permeability of the bubble is variable. The RGBM takes the VPM and changes some of the mathematical constants. It's more refined, it's probably 10 to 15 years newer, and that's what I'm using in my algorithms right now when we create decompression tables. The VPM was created by Professor Yount and Hoffman in Hawaii. It's a perfusion-limited model that focuses on the amount of separate gas with a bubble gradient increasing with depth. What does that mean? Well, it's exactly the opposite of how our traditional Haldanian models work. The bubble model says that as we take the diver deeper, we get rid of bubbles, and he's less likely to get bent. The tissue model says that if we take the diver deeper, he's more likely to get bent. So these 2 models are in exact opposites of each other. The whole method in which they work is contradictory to one another. The reduced bubble gradient model was derived by Dr. Weinke. It's devised a more modern phase algorithm that addresses repetitive diving and diving at altitude with the use of air, nitrox, heliox, and trimix. It employs an iterative approach using a weighted split between free blood and dissolved blood gradients. What does that mean? The RGBM has both a bubble model and a tissue model at the same time. It's obvious that we're breathing gas, so the gas must go into our tissues, and it's from the tissues that the bubbles acquire the gas. So a model that works well has got to account for both sides of the equation, and that's what the RGBM does so well. It looks at the tissue and it looks at the bubble formation at the same time. And there are moments in a dive where the tissue saturation is in control, and there's other moments where the bubble creation is in control. And what we try to do in this model is to balance those two, so that at any depth, at any time, and with any gas, we can always make sure that you're not going to bubble more than absolutely necessary. As it says, the RGBM is a dual-phase model that tracks both the dissolved gas in your tissues and the free phases as the bubble nuclei by limiting the critical excitation radii. Now, this is the key, most important part of this whole bubble model. We believe that these little micronuclei, which are tiny, much smaller than a blood cell, much smaller, at any given moment we're filled with these nuclei, whether we're diving or we're on the surface. But as we dive, the pressure increases and it crushes these nuclei down. There's a magic size for every bubble at every pressure when the bubble becomes activated. When it becomes activated, it's excited. And once it's excited, it has the potential to grow. The key, we think, in this bubble theory is to not let the bubble or the micronuclei ever become excited. To keep it just below this threshold where it wants to attract more gas. What this tells us when we use this model is that deeper decompression stops maximize the free phase elimination. That reduces the number of those bubbles or the bubble seeds, which increases as pressure increases. Directly opposite from elimination of dissolved phases, which increases as pressure decreases. This is that difference I was telling you. In other words, we start off with 100 of these micronuclei, and you're at the surface. The diver goes down to 100 meters. At 100 meters, perhaps there's only 50 micronuclei left. The pressure has literally squeezed these little bubbles all the way down until they no longer exist. They just go away. By getting rid of these, by going deep, when you come back up, there are less of them to begin to form real bubbles that cause decompression sickness. One of the reasons that RGBM was specifically created was to address repetitive diving, which most all of us are doing, and to address high altitude diving. I live in Colorado. I live at about 2,000 meters elevation. I dive at around 3,000 meters elevation. Occasionally we can go as high as 4,000 meters. Decompression models do a really bad job at high altitude. They're very, very poor. We have some divers in South America that are diving at 5,000 meters. The higher you get, the harder it is for the decompression algorithm to work. And if you can find an algorithm that works at altitude, it's a very good way of validating that it'll work at sea level very well. The RGBM reduces the permissible bubble numbers. In other words, we said the body can only tolerate so many of these bubbles before DCS begins. It reduces the permissible gradient, which is how much ascent or descent you can tolerate before you must stop. It penalizes a deeper than previous dive. This is real important. If you think about this, you'll understand that. First dive of the day. Diver goes in the water, he goes down. We crush these nuclei, but we're also energizing them at the same time. So let's say you make a dive to 100 meters. You come down, crush the nuclei, then you come back up. Many of those nuclei are now gone, but the other ones have been energized. If you were to go and make a second dive and you went below 100 meters, you would re-energize the first micronuclei. So this model says we never want you to do that. Make your first dive deep, and every other dive must be shallower and shallower and shallower. This fits perfectly with what we've all been taught for 20 or 30 years. Your first dive should always be your deepest dive. But the tissue models didn't give us a good reason why the first dive should be the deepest dive. The bubble model explains it perfectly. If you make a second dive deeper than your first, you're going to increase the likelihood that these micronuclei will become excited and grow into bubbles. We now have a very good reason why not to make your second dive deeper. And lastly, the RGBM has its effects across all the different tissue groups. From the fastest tissues to the slowest tissues, it has an impact. To give you a little comparison, for dives shallower than 70 meters, the RGBM schedules for air are between the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy schedules. RGBM schedules in general are shorter for deeper dives than the Navy tables. Goes on to say helium schedules are close to the total times for the Navy, but call for deeper stops. At the very end of the presentation, I'm going to show you a bunch of schedules, and you'll be able to see this numerically, what these differences are. Alright, now we're going to get into theory a little bit. An introduction to bubbles. The pressure of gas inside the bubble is equal to the surrounding hydrostatic pressure plus the contribution from what's called surface tension. A bubble about the size of a red blood cell has its pressure raised up about 1/2 bar internally. So, merely to have a bubble exist, the pressure inside the bubble must be a little bit greater than the pressure on the outside. If it's not, the bubble tends to just collapse slowly and go away all by itself. Now this should be a little graphic that should come together. Again, again, and again. This shows how the pressure on the outside comes in, squeezes against the surface of the bubble, causes the bubble to constrict, and where we get the additional 0.5 atmosphere or 0.5 bar pressure. Merely the surface of the bubble to contain the gas within the bubble has to exert a force. So your bubble tends to have more pressure than the surrounding tissue. But that's also the reason that the bubble wants to go away. If everything is static, everything being the same, bubbles don't want to exist. They want to dissolve naturally. Gas diffuses from the bubble. If the pressure inside the bubble is greater than the pressure of the dissolved gas in the surrounding tissue, the gas will move out of the bubble, and the bubble will shrink and eventually go away. However, once we've created the bubble, if the gas pressure in the tissue surrounding the bubble is greater than it is inside, then the bubble grows. And this is the key. If all we have is the micronuclei, and we have lots of pressure around it, nothing's going to happen. But if that micronuclei has become activated or it's stimulated, and it begins to grow into a bubble, then the gas will flow into the bubble and the bubble grows. And that's what we want to stop. Let's see. And again. So, if the pressure inside the bubble is greater than the pressure in the tissue, the gas moves out. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Once we have a bubble, now we have to treat it, and we want to get that gas out. And we get the gas out generally by ascending. As you ascend, the pressure on the outside of the tissue drops, the pressure on the bubble grows, and if we do this slowly, not so fast that the bubble grows uncontrollably, if we do it slowly, then we give that time for the gas to get back out. This is especially true for divers, since the dissolved gas pressure is lower than the ambient pressure due to oxygen metabolism. Everyone here, I hope, has heard of the term called the oxygen window. The gas pressure that we breathe in to our lungs is always a little bit higher than what it is actually inside of our body, because our body consumes the oxygen. There's always an inherent advantage for a diver. But even if a stable hydrostatically, bubbles and nuclei, because of the constricting surface tension, will eventually collapse. Given time, bubbles don't want to exist in your body. They want to go away. Except after decompression. After decompression, you've caused a massive change in the pressures, and that's why we have to manage the decompression carefully. If you come up too fast, the external pressure drops so quickly the bubble has no choice but to expand rapidly, and we never want to let that happen. The varying permeability model explains why bubbles don't always dissolve, and there's a lot of ideas as to why this may happen, but the best explanation we think so far is that the tiny bubbles become stabilized with what are called surface active molecules. The bubble itself doesn't exist just as a little pocket of air. It becomes coated, and the coating on the outside of the bubble is what causes us the problem. The molecules that embed themselves in the gas-water interface are called surfactants, and this is a biological coating that comes around the bubble and encases the bubble. These surface-active molecules push away water. As they form around the bubble, they create a shell or a casing that makes the bubble impenetrable to gas. Gas can't get in, gas can't get out. It's a bad thing in both cases. The outside casing becomes hydrophobic. It repels water, whereas the inside on the tails, can we go back? Sorry, thank you. Whereas the inside of the surface molecules attract water, and that keeps this little bubble sealed. If it was able to stop the gas just from getting into the bubble, it'd be great. We'd love this. That would stop our bubbles from growing. The problem is this stops the gas from getting out of the bubble as well. Just as each water molecule pulls towards another water molecule to create surface tension, each of the active molecules pushes against each other. This counteracts the effect of surface tension and therefore eliminates the loss of gas by diffusion. No diffusion means no dissolution. If we can't get the gas back out of the bubble's not going to go away. So we've got to find a way to always let the gas move both in and out of the bubble. Surfactants can be thought of as tiny springs pushing against each other at the interface, or at the edge of the bubble. So if we think of those little molecules as springs, as the bubble is compressed, these springs push against each other. They get stronger and stronger and stronger to the point where there's an absolute barrier and the gas can't move in and out. If we push it a little bit harder, the springs begin to explode off and they fly off the surface of the bubble. When a bubble is compressed by descending, the area available for each spring lowers. The springs get tighter and tighter. Basically, each spring pushes back more and more as it bumps against its neighbors. But just like real springs, eventually it can't push back anymore. It runs out of travel. At this point, the springs will start popping off the surface. These surface molecules have no choice but to break away from the bubble, and at that point, the diffusion can start moving again. Leave the surface rather than to compress further. The effect of surface tension is now countered, and the bubble stabilizes at its smaller radius. This is what crushing does. As we compress and compress and compress these bubbles, finally the shell shatters, it breaks, the bubble shrinks, and the bubble gets stabilized. Now, if we do this with the micronuclei, we can get them so small eventually they're very stable and they're very happy to be tiny, and they'll stay that way. They're much less likely to grow and become a full-fledged bubble later on. We'll recall that bubbles grow when the dissolved gas pressure is greater than the interior bubble pressure. This means that small bubbles require a greater supersaturation in order to be stimulated into growth. Therefore, crushed nuclei are better for divers than uncrushed nuclei. And this goes back to making that deep dive, first dive of your series. All things being equal, there is always a gradient tending to force gas out of the bubble, thus making the bubble collapse on itself because of surface tension pressure. Now, we make a dive. You You make your decompression, you come all the way back to the surface. We all know that we have to go through a surface interval, or a period of time before we can make the next dive. During that surface interval, all of these bubbles that you've created naturally, over time, constrict down and eventually go away. And after 3 to 7 days, all of the bubbles are completely gone and you're right back to where you began, with this bed plane, with this seed plane of micronuclei. Didn't I just say that the surface tension was negated by the crushed nuclei? Sure did. But this would mean that big bubbles would grow just as easily as the small bubbles. But it's not quite the way it happens. At first, the bubble begins to expand, but then the springs, the surfactants on the outside of the shell of the bubble, lose contact with each other. When they can't push against each other, then the surface tension takes over again. So we can, at different pressures, with different gases, the different sizes of bubbles grow differently than each other. The little ones don't grow at the same speed as the medium ones, which don't grow at the same speed as the big ones. The surfactants form a barrier to diffusion. They close and they encase the bubble, but they stop the gas from moving in and out. The closer that they're squeezed together, the stronger the barrier to diffusion is. The surfactants either don't form a diffusive barrier or they completely block the diffusion. So it's sort of an either-or. Either the bubble can take gas and relieve gas, or the doors are closed and no gas can get in or out. This impermeability, the point where the bubble completely closes down and no gas can get in, occurs at around 95 meters of pressure. So usually for most scuba divers, you're never going to get to the point where the bubbles become impermeable. But if some of you are diving below 95 meters, then it might become an issue. An impermeable bubble won't be crushed as much as a permeable bubble because the gas can't diffuse out of it as it shrinks. The pressure on the inside will just get higher and higher and higher as it gets to that final point. Now, what value is in this? I said the first dive we should make is a crushing dive. This tells us that we want that crushing dive to not be deeper than 95 meters. Because if we make that first dive below 95, you're not gaining any advantage. A little later on, I'm going to talk to you about a short spike dive and why that's not a bad idea for a long series of dives. It's the first deep dive, maybe much deeper than you need normally, to wipe out all these micronuclei for a whole week of diving. But what we're finding is that 95 meters is about the most that you're going to get any advantage. If you were to make your deep dive to 120 meters or 150 meters, there's no extra advantage. Much beyond 90, 95 meters, you've got all the advantage you're going to get at that first crushing dive. Now let's talk a little bit about bubble crushing. We assume that the gas pressure in the bubble is equal to the outside tissue pressure. Given enough time, the bubble wants to be at the same pressure. If the pressure of the gas around the bubble is higher, gas goes in. If the pressure around the bubble is lower, gas goes out. The bubble wants to be at the same pressure as the rest of your body. Ignoring the oxygen effect, this means that the bubble pressure is equal to the ambient pressure, since the ambient pressure would be the tissue pressure. This process of crushing these bubbles is what we call denucleation. If denucleation is size selective, and we think it is, in other words, the different size bubbles are affected differently by pressure, then greater hydrostatic pressures crush smaller and smaller nuclei. And if number distributions of nuclei increase with decreasing radius, this means there's probably a heck of a lot more tiny nuclei than there are of large nuclei than there are of large bubbles. The bigger the bubble, the less of them you're going to see. The smaller, the more likely you're going to find some. Then a conservative deep dive, followed by a sufficient surface interval, should afford a margin of safety by crushing many of these nuclei and reducing the numbers of available nuclei potentially excited into growth under compression decompression. That's the key to this whole thing. That's one of the two most important things I'm telling you in the entire presentation. We don't know it for a fact. It's It's not proven. We think this is the case. It may be strongly to our advantage as technical divers for the very first dive in a series to be a deep, crushing dive. This is a dive where you go to 70, 80, 90 meters and you spend a few minutes, not 10, 15, or 20 minutes, but 3 or 4 minutes. A classic bounce dive. Go down, spend a couple minutes, do a normal decompression all the way back to the surface, and potentially you're going to wipe out many, many of these micronuclei in your body. If this is the case, and only time will tell if this is true, then that may significantly lower your chance of getting decompression sickness later on in the rest of your dives. The nuclei is exponentially restored to its original size, though, as the surfactants, these surface active molecules, return back during your ascent. Nuclei smaller than a critical radius, at every pressure, there's a specific radius of bubble that we know we can measure that is that moment where the bubble wants to get bigger or it wants to get smaller. That specific critical radius will not support the transition, will disappear in time. This process occurs over many days, but may occur faster in living organisms. We can measure the size of a bubble at any depth. And we know, for instance, that if you're at 70 meters depth, the critical size of a helium bubble is so many microns across. If we can keep that bubble size at less than the critical size, it will not grow. It just won't happen. And that's the key to how we plan the decompression now. We're going to look at how long you've been in the water, what gases you've breathed, and where we think these seed sizes are at. And we want to track these and never let them start growing. Even a bubble not stimulated to growth will expand as the pressure drops. What does this mean? If you're down at 70 or 80 meters and you suddenly shoot to the surface, okay, and I don't care how small the micronuclei is, if the outside pressure just goes away, that bubble's going to expand. It has no choice. So making a rapid ascent is always, without exception, a bad thing to do. The RGBM algorithm suggests strongly that not only we make not a rapid ascent, but we make a slow ascent. Probably slower than any of you guys are diving right now. 20 meters per minute for years and years was the standard. Then they thought, yeah, we should slow this down, 15 meters a minute. Now we're slowing it down more, 10 meters a minute, 5 meters a minute. The slower you come up, the less opportunity these micronuclei and seeds have to become energized and take off. Time is to your advantage. Bubbles grow when the supersaturation pressure is greater than the surface tension. But nuclei growth during decompression makes the nuclei easier to turn into full-fledged bubbles. Of course, you're ascending. Pressure is dropping. Lots of things are happening. If a bubble is going to form, it's going to form during your ascent. It's going to form during your decompression. That's obvious. The VPM predicts that there is an exponential distribution of nuclei. There's lots and lots of the tiny ones, and only a few of the big ones. And the big ones are what we're worried about. The number of nuclei stimulated into growth is related to the minimum size stimulated into growth. All right. So we think there's 1,000 micronuclei in your body. Maybe 900 of them are so small we don't have to worry about them. But that other 100 potentially can cross that threshold and start to grow. And those are the ones that we track inside of the algorithm. The VPM also assumes that there's a minimum number of these bubbles, regardless of the size, that can be tolerated without you developing decompression sickness. Now, this is a big change. We don't know for sure, but our best guess right now is that two things are happening in your body. Your body can only tolerate so many physical bubbles before something goes wrong. And at the same time, it can only tolerate so much physical gas. You may have a half a liter, a quarter of a liter, a fifth of a liter of gas. There seems to be a biomechanical point where if you have too many of these little bubbles and too much gas in solution, you're going to have problems. Trying to quantify where that magic point is very difficult. Style dives. but it seems it's too conservative for our normal recreational dives. We think that the solution then is the combination, both of how much gas and how many bubbles occur at the same time. Fast tissues, as you've all been taught at open diving class, remove the inert gas faster than a slow tissue. So, as you breathe into your lung and your alveoli are probably the fastest tissue in your body. Gas passes in and passes out instantly. There's almost no retention. However, your bones, probably your thigh bones, are the slowest in your body. Gas moves into the bone very slowly, and gas moves out even slower. This means that bubbles don't have the time to grow as big in the fast tissues as they do in the slow tissues. Hopefully this makes sense. We have a bubble, and this bubble is surrounded by blood, let's say. The blood can move gas pressure in and out very quickly. So even if the pressure in the blood is high and it wants to get into the bubble, as you ascend, the gas is coming out of the blood so fast that the bubble can't grab the pressure. So you don't tend to find people getting DCS problems in their fast tissues. We tend to find them in the slow tissues. Well, the slow tissue at depth filled up with gas. And now the bubble has opportunity to pull that gas in, and the bubble can grow and grow and grow because the bone can't get rid of the gas fast enough. So the bubble has an opportunity to take off. And that's why the slow tissues become real important on long, deep dives. Initially, the bubbles grow faster because of the typically higher pressure difference, but this is greatly outweighed as a quick removal of the source gas in a fast tissue. This means that fast tissues can have lots of small bubbles, while the slow tissues can hardly have any bubbles at all above this critical minimum number. A greater supersaturation is allowed for fast tissues. Now, any of you that have used the ABYSS program, I hope some of you have seen it, know on the bottom there's a little tissue graph. You see the pictures of the tissue bars moving back and forth. Your fast tissues shoot back and they move very quickly, whereas the slow tissues at the bottom just barely move at all. The supersaturation is how much additional pressure above ambient that a theoretical tissue compartment can tolerate before it becomes bent. A tissue with a half time of 1 minute, the fastest possible tissue, may be able to take 20 or 30 times the normal pressure that it currently has without being injured because the gas moves in and out so fast. Whereas a slow tissue may not be able to take 2 or 3% more than its normal ambient tolerable pressure. I don't have a good graph to show you, and I apologize. If I can fire up the program at the end after we're done with the lecture, I'll show you graphically what this looks like and how a tissue compartment actually determines when you go into and out of decompression. The VPM starts out by just stimulating the minimum safe number of bubbles. The maximum allowed supersaturation is then increased step by step, and the volume of excess gas in each compartment is compared to the maximum permitted. If it is less than allowed, the supersaturation is increased again and again until the compartment maximum is reached. What does this mean? This is called decompression by trial and error. The way we compute decompression stops mathematically, we have you at 10 meters. I want to take you to 6 meters. That's your next stop. Or excuse me, you're at 9 meters and we want to go to 6. I will tell the program, I'll tell the computer, ascend the diver to 6 meters. All right, check all the tissue pressures, check all the bubbles. If any one of these violate, take the diver back down, add 1 more minute to decompression. All right, go back up, try it again. Violate, go back down, add 1 more minute. And we do this up again and again and again and again. We do thousands and thousands of these computations. And that's how the algorithm itself actually generates 9 meter stop, 6 meter stop, 3 meter stop. It's by doing many, many, many trial ascents. Every 1 minute we try to take you up, try to take you up, try to take you up. Ah, we're up. Go to the next one, go to the next one. Try, 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 try. And until we have enough minutes, and eventually you have a 20-minute stop, a 30-minute stop, a 40-minute stop, at some point we can ascend to the next stop. Interesting point here. The smaller your decompression interval is, we typically do a 3 meter interval. But there's nothing magic about doing a 3 meter interval. You can do a 2 meter interval. You can do a 1 meter interval. You can do a 1 foot interval. The smaller your decompression interval is, the less decompression you have to do. this is something that most people have never heard about, the smaller the transition in pressure is, the more efficient your decompression is. A perfect decompression is a continuous decompression. We start the diver, and we bring him up like this. Ever so slowly. And you never stop. We've done some modeling just for fun to see, do you think it would be possible to make a 200-meter dive, spend 10 minutes on the bottom, and have no decompression? Anyone here willing to try? Okay. I'll bet you it can be done. It's all a matter of your rate of ascent. If we slow you down enough, put you in a chamber, have a little valve on the outside, have a very slow, continuous ascent all the way to the surface, have no decompression, not a single stop. Now, we can't practically do this in the ocean, of course, but there's some interesting things here for you to learn. I do some cave diving. It's one of the things I enjoy. Some of the caves allow me to lay on the bottom and literally walk my way up to the water. This allows you to do a continuous decompression. I can look at my computer and say, okay, I'm at 10 meters. I crawl up the side to 9 meters. I'm at 9 meters, go to 8, go to 7. And you can chase the decompression ceiling. How much will it save you? It'll save you a few minutes. It's not a big deal. But it's nice to know in the back of your head. It's a little piece of education you can have. The longer and the deeper the dive, the more time you'll save by doing a smooth, continuous ascent. You also know that we don't have to make a final stop at 3 meters. You might do it at 5 meters, you might do it at 6 meters. If the ocean's terrible, you could do it at 10 meters. But you can be there a long time. Same reasons. The more that you can work with your decompression profiles, the more efficient and the more effective you can make your decompression. Just because you've been used to doing it in one way, keep your minds open and look around. There may be other alternatives for you. There's other ways to get you out of the water a little bit faster. Next slide. Hydrophobic crevices can also form these nuclei. Now, everyone here's probably had a glass of beer. And you know, as you pour the glass of beer and you can look at the side of the glass and it's perfectly clean, and then suddenly a bubble just appears. Just spontaneously appears. This is similar to what's happening in your body. In this case, the dissolved gas in the glass has found a crevice. That crevice is a micronuclei. It's a point where the gas molecules can come and attach. And you'll look at it and just suddenly there it is. It just spontaneously forms. Nuclei may also be continuously created by friction in your joints and muscles and by the cavitation in your heart valves. So the mere fact that you're alive and your heart is pumping may be generating all these micronuclei. Now, we don't know yet, but some people in the theoretical group think that this may in fact be more important than the crushing and regeneration effects. It may be that just because we're alive, we generate these damn micronuclei. And there may be nothing we can do about it in the long term. As long as your heart's beating and your lungs are breathing, you may just keep generating these things, and we have to deal with it. And it may turn out, and we may find over time, why some people get bent on the exact same dive and somebody else doesn't. I mean, everyone's heard of the dive where 3 divers go out, same profile, same wreck, do the exact same thing. One guy comes up and gets bent, and the other 2 guys don't. And it may turn out that this cavitation, or this just natural movement of arms and joints and legs, and one person generated these nuclei and the other 2 didn't. And there's no rhyme or reason to it at all. The VPM recommendations make sense for a lot of reasons. Surfactant-stabilized micronuclei may or may not prove to be the key player in human decompression sickness. I certainly think it has a lot going for it. If this is the case, I'm going to step way out on the branch here. If the surfactant-stabilized micronuclei prove to be a big deal, then maybe there's something we can do about it chemically. Right? I don't know where that is, I don't know what it is, but maybe we're going to come up with a pill at some point that will make our decompression more efficient by being able to attack these surfactants. If we can move those surfactants away to some extent, then the gas will move in and out of the bubble more efficiently. That's a possibility. Turn the page. Greater supersaturation stimulates more bubbles into growth. We know that. That's an absolute. Greater crushing pressures help minimize the number of stimulated nuclei. So these two are somewhat in opposition to each other, but we want to remember that. That first crushing dive is probably a really good idea. Making deep, long dives is probably a bad idea, though we have to do it sometimes. Next. Adaptation. Everyone has probably heard that the guy who dives more often is less likely to get bent than the person who doesn't. We have the pearl divers, we have sponge divers, we have people that dive on a regular basis. There is a growing body of evidence that diving often is better than diving seldom. It's called physical adaptation. By making the first dive a deep, short, crushing dive, constricting micronuclei to a smaller, safer size is a good thing. Making succeeding dives progressively shallower and staying within the crush depth of the first dive minimizes the development of these new micronuclei. Frequently diving, such as every other day, which depletes the number of micronuclei in your body that contribute to bubble formation. So, the guy that goes in the water and makes the first crushing dive, he goes after the pearls, goes down 50, 60 meters and grabs a bed full of pearls and comes up. He's crushed many of the micronuclei. They're now gone. And it will take 4 to 7 days under normal conditions for his body to fill up with these. If he then dives again that afternoon, and the next day, and the next day, and the day after that, the body never has a chance to regenerate all these seeds. That guy has an advantage over the person who only makes one dive a week. Because he has less seeds, or less micronuclei, he has less opportunity to get bent. So there's some advantage to being a frequent diver. Dr. Weinke has told me that if nucleation sites are eliminated, their numbers reduced, or that they become less predisposed to excitation, the risk to bubble formation is commensurately reduced. If you have less places to start, there's less opportunities to have bubbles form. Regeneration times for these classes of micronuclei are estimated to be about a week. That's what I'm saying, 5 to 7 days. Next slide. All right. Now, how do we put this all to use? Theory is wonderful. You've all just had a quick and dirty introduction of bubble theory. Now let's talk about how we make this stuff work.